Welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. When we look around the world today, and this is very specific to my background and my interests, I know, but I'll just acknowledge that. But I'm fascinated by the way that leaders and the activity of leadership is influencing what we do and how we do what we do, and not just domestically in the United States, but across the globe. I mean, leaders have, power. There's no question about that. And I'm going to be, very simplistic here. When we strip away the characteristics that most people assign to leaders, around personality or the ways that they show up, or strip away all of that stuff, and what you're left with is somebody that's causing movement. I mean, that's essentially what a leader does, is they cause movement. The question comes into play here, for the sake of what? What's that movement serving? That ideal, is there an ideal even in play here, or is it just, self-serving? What's the movement that's being caused here, which opens the door to leadership? Leadership is the activity of influencing others in order to co-create coordinated movement. That movement. Am I getting the kind of movement I need to get the results that I say is important? So that's kind of where my orientation and focus is. And I look at the stage today, the world stage today, and I see leaders, some doing that, some, just causing movement, and it's chaotic as hell. It's just kind of really interesting. So my guest today, and I'm thrilled, and both thrilled and honored to have Philippe Johnson joining us today. Retired Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, 24 years of active duty, served, fixed and rotary wing pilot. I mean, I'm a private pilot myself. Rotary wings have always escaped me. It's kind of like, wait a minute, my wing is moving. How does that work? Also a former intelligence officer in the Air Force, and a diplomat as a military attaché. So he brings a wealth of experience. And what's fascinating to me, and his publishers sent this to me, and I'm going to just, those of you that are watching this, not just listening to it, a beautiful new book. What Hangs in the Balance? What Hangs in the Balance? A Case for Principled, Ethical, Competent, and Courageously Selfless Leadership. That title, it just kind of got me when I looked at it. And so I'm, again, both thrilled and honored to have Phil joining us, Lieutenant Colonel, retired. Thank you for your service. I'm going to just start, real quickly with a simple question. This is a thick book. This was not written overnight. What compelled you, number one, to take this on? I've written 5 books, and the 3 of them were just pure agony. It was like giving birth. My wife told me. The other 2 were not so bad, but this is a big book. What compelled you to take this on, Phil?
It is big, and it was even more obscenely large when I subjected the first draft to some of my former colleagues. So, so long story short, I think I started to notice pretty early on in Trump's first term that what I was seeing in terms of leadership was an aberration in both style and substance. At least from the norms that I experienced and practiced over 24 years of active duty and 28 years, if you count 4 years of ROTC at the University of Florida. So I woke up New Year's Day, 2019, and decided I was going to start reading all of his presidential tweets. I know it's X now, but
20,000+ in that first,
exactly. As Kellyanne Conway once said, he needed to tweet like we needed to eat. So I started reading all of his tweets, starting with Inauguration Day 2017. And as you said, 25,000 tweets later, by the end of his term, although well before that, I had dozens of leadership competencies and traits I wanted to address in the context of his first term. So that's how it started. And of course, the research continued with the news every day, speeches, different things, reports. So that's how it started.
Okay. So curiosity was part of that, but also just, your experience. And I mean, I love the military, and I mean that in a very sincere way because of the way leaders are developed. The way that leaders are developed, and I don't care if you're a grunt or if you've got stars on your epaulets here. Leaders, everybody's a leader, and that's why I like that simple definition that I posited, that leaders cause movement. That's what leaders do, and by definition, everybody's a leader because everybody's causing movement all the time. And you can't enter a scenario or a situation or an environment and not have pieces move around to accommodate your presence. So that's the movement.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the academy, Air Force Academy or the Naval Academy or West Point, you just take these different academies. Character matters. Every one of the academies speaks to character. There's it's kind of like the thread that runs through everything that you do. What character traits do you identify as being absolutely crucial to what I'm going to call effective leadership? And we'll define what that term means a little bit down the road here. But in the context of effective leadership, what character traits are you think most salient?
So you mean character traits as distinct from just leadership competencies in general?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
just the
Yeah.
who that I am that kind of
So
shows up here.
sure. So the ones I chose to address are humility, empathy, respect for dignity, discipline and self-control, and honesty. To me, those are the essential character
hmm
traits.
So if I assume that those can be the foundational, bedrock upon which I build leadership competencies, skills, and that sort of thing, when you look around the world today, how many leaders are actually exhibiting those characteristics, those character traits?
Not too many, and and they do it selectively, and it's more challenging when you look at people in politics. Although that doesn't necessarily excuse what I tend to focus on in a lot of the book, which is unprincipled action or unprincipled loyalty.
Yeah.
So it's certainly a problem with elected officials. Maybe less so with those who are appointed in government, but it's an issue everywhere in every organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Loyalty. That's, as and I, and listeners, I want you to hear this. This is not a political conversation. Okay, I don't care if you lean right or you lean left, whether you're red or blue. That's not the point here. What I'm looking at and what I wanted to have this conversation be about is the nature of leadership and the consequence of either effective or ineffective leadership, and what determines what's effective and what's not effective. Um, you talk about loyalty in the book, and the idea, and I hadn't seen this before. That was principled and unprincipled loyalty. That was a real interesting distinction that you drew there. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by both of those terms? Because in part, I'm bringing this up because Donald Trump right now. There's a whole buzz around. Yeah, we're going to populate the government with people that pass, quote unquote, pass kind of a loyalty test, not loyalty to the country, but loyalty to the Donald Trump.
Yeah, and before I answer your question, I'll just say the problem with that is it's twofold. One, you have people in government who are going to be afraid to speak out because they're
Yep.
afraid of being branded as disloyal. The other issue is when it comes to hiring people and you put the emphasis on loyalty, what's going to suffer is competence. So those are two concerns. So yeah, so when I looked at the definition of loyalty, which can be expressed as like an unswerving allegiance, expressed as faithfulness to a private person or a cause, an ideal, or a government. Those are straight out of a dictionary. Um, the common thread there behind that loyalty is principle. There should be a principle there. Um, So the idea that of loyalty for loyalty's sake, for example, is not a virtue, in my opinion. Um, so that's a recurring theme throughout the book is people who unfortunately make decisions from the standpoint of what I consider unprincipled loyalty because of some, bogus notion of reciprocity, or for the purpose of self-interest, for getting closer to power and influence, and so on and so forth. So um, there's a big distinction there. And then I have plenty of examples in the book of people who do put principle and duty at the forefront of decision making, and who act in a principled manner. For example, there are a lot of people who worked for Trump in the first term who, in my opinion, and I give plenty of examples, are practicing this kind of principled loyalty, where they were trying to be loyal to their boss, but not at the expense of other things like their oath to the Constitution, the core values and principles of their organizations. And so you can be principled and still try to work for the best interests of your boss, in that case, the president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, I mean, that's a fine line that gets walked here, because, the oath to support and protect the Constitution, is an important oath. And most people, in government, in some way, shape, or form, give allegiance to that oath. They they say, "Yep, I'm in," sort of a thing here. Um, the title here of your book is "What Hangs in the Balance." What are you thinking is hanging in the balance?
Sure. So what hangs in the balance is another way of saying what's at risk. What's at risk when you don't have principled, ethical, competent, and selfless leadership? I mean, the short answer is potentially anything and everything. But to be more specific, what's at risk, for example, at the organizational level, are things like morale, retention, the ability to recruit, and ultimately, and most importantly, mission accomplishment. Now, if we zoom up to a more macro perspective, the things that hang in the balance are things like quality of life, even life itself, occasionally, good governance, national security, trust in democratic institutions, and even the rule of law.
Yeah, the rule of law. That's I was, again, I just got the copy of the book the other day, and I was just kind of I'm going to just read this. This is a fascinating thing. Day one of Trump's inauguration, or following the inauguration, he issued some executive orders, and one of them had to do with pardoning the January 6th insurrectionists. And what's interesting here, and this was October 30th, 2020. This was a Donald Trump tweet. One of the most important issues is law and order. Biden stands with the rioters and looters. I stand with the heroes of law enforcement. If Biden wins, the rioters in the streets will be running your federal government. No city, no family, and no community will be safe. How do I square that circle with what
Well, the
is
short answer is democracy, but that also ties into the unprincipled loyalty. People do something for you that's not proper, and you reward that. And in this case, with pardons, that cycle kind of played out with Roger Stone and others in
Yeah.
Trump's first term, where, for example, Stone lied to Congress to protect Trump. His sentence was reduced. His sentence was eventually commuted just before he was supposed to report to prison. Eventually, he was pardoned, and obviously that's gonna create loyalty, although I consider it unprincipled loyalty from that person who
Mhm.
benefits. Um, but yeah, there's really no way of defending, I think, what we just saw with the pardons. That's not to say that every case was perhaps adjudicated in the best manner. I don't know, but
Yeah.
clearly overall it's a travesty to have done that.
When we look at the nature of leadership causing movement as an example here, um, the question that I want to frame has to do with effectiveness. And yeah, and I'll just ask this question, and then we can kind of unbundle it from there. How would you define leadership effectiveness? A highly effective
effectiveness.
leader will X or create X.
Yeah, so my experience is obviously my background is public service. That
Hmm.
said, I think most of the leadership competencies and traits I address in the book also apply to the private sector. So you're asking how I would define effectiveness, and I think you have to tie that to the mission of an organization.
Hmm.
Is the organization accomplishing its mission? Um, you know, what's at stake is the power to affect people's lives, whether that's subordinates within your organization or customers of the organization or constituents if you're an elected official. Um, so without going into the weeds with that, that's
There's a lot of
it's
weeds around that.
accomplishing the mission essentially.
Yeah. So, and thank you for that. And the title of this podcast obviously is the soul of business, and one of the lenses through which I look when I'm working with my clients is how, as a leader, how do you manage to keep people connected to that core mission? Because that's the soul of the organization. It's that without this piece, we cease to exist. Yeah, we can't not have this be part of who we are because it is who we are. Um, Leaders that can find ways to connect to that soul, in my words, are effective leaders, and they do it through a number of modalities. Obviously, influencing strategies, communication. I mean, just all kinds of different things here. Um,
Yeah,
where does selfless leadership come into that? And I'm making a distinction here between selfless leadership and servant leadership.
yeah. Where does service selfless leadership come into the soul
Yeah, that's
of the
the,
business?
the gestalt, the whole, but also more specifically, finding ways to keep ourselves connected to the spirit, the soul of who we are and in this case, as a nation, but also as a business. I mean, how do I keep connected to that purpose, that core mission of who we are?
Yeah, so certainly if the subordinate can see a commitment to the mission of the organization, and that leader is putting his subordinates in the mission ahead of his own interests, that's one way to do it. Um, Setting the example, you have to not only communicate but exemplify the core values and principles of the organization. Yeah, and there are a lot of ways to demonstrate selflessness, by putting your own welfare, uh, not putting your own welfare ahead of those of your subordinates, admitting to mistakes and even wrongdoing, giving credit to those who deserve it, um, even practicing what I call principled loyalty to a superior you don't like, um, following lawful orders you don't like,
Hmm.
and yeah, so those are a few examples.
Yeah, following lawful orders that you don't like. Yeah, that's yeah. And that's not just in a military lexicon. That's also in business because we have to make choices in business that feel, oh, I don't want to do that, and it's in service of this greater good. And so we kind of
And
climb
for
on
elected
board.
officials, that selflessness regulates the instinct for self-preservation that I think causes a lot of elected officials to confuse self-interest with the public interest.
Uh huh. Yeah. Say more about that if you would, please. That's that. I like that.
Okay, yeah. So I think so often what we see from our elected officials, they're compromising so much. They're compromising their values. I've not been an elected official, so I can't say I really appreciate the pressures of getting elected, of having to curry the favor of donors and to get out there and get votes and so on. But that doesn't mean you still can't be principled. And and again, for elected officials, part of that self-preservation is getting reelected. And I feel that we see people compromising far too often for the goal of doing that. Now, there are examples of people, for example, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who elected to serve on the January 6th committee, who knew full well it was going to hurt their political careers, and it in fact ended their political careers. But they knew that going into it because they believed in what they were doing. They believed in accountability, and so that's what I would call moral courage.
Mm-hmm.
Acting in a principled manner despite what you are fairly sure the consequences are going to be.
Yeah, and that's a big bite for some people.
Yeah.
That's a big bite for most people, I think. Yeah. Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. In your career, both in the military, and I acknowledge, 28 years, including ROTC, but how would you describe your leadership maturation, your leadership journey? I guess, yeah. What have you noticed about, when you were 18 years old in ROTC to where you're at today, coming through this? What have you learned about leadership that is serving you today in a way that it may not have served you back when you were a 20-year-old or somebody that was just coming into the Air Force?
Wow, those are a lot of years to consider. I think it's different for everyone. I think if you come in with a certain set of beliefs and you come in with certain values and character traits that you feel are important, if those have been instilled even before you get formal leadership training, that leadership training may not be particularly dramatic. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think early on, the leadership training was more about setting the example, maintaining standards, discipline and self-control. Obviously, over my career, there was a lot of management as well besides leadership. Yeah. And those two overlap very often.
Yeah.
But once I suppose I'd entered the Air Force, you start to pick up on cues from leaders, both good and bad. And that's one of the points I make in the book is that I find it's often easier to learn from bad examples. And what that does is those bad examples tend to reinforce what you've already learned. They reinforce the things that you should be doing. So they serve as very valuable examples, and that's why I thought it was a worthwhile project to write a book that has lots of real world examples of what not to do, but I supplement that at the same time with why it shouldn't be done that way and what should be done instead, and examples of people who do act in a principled and ethical manner. Often people who were, in President Trump's case, working directly for him. Mm-hmm. So it's funny. I think that my leadership training in ROTC was so solid, to use lack of a better word, that it set a really good foundation for the rest of my career. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I had leadership education, through Air Command Staff College and Air War College, professional military education along the way. That was mostly a lot of reading. But so yeah, you continue. It's a process of continual learning, which, of course, as you know, is an important thing for leaders to be constantly learning, to be curious. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, that last point, to be constantly learning. I mean, compare. This is a compare contrast sort of a question here. In the book, you certainly use Donald Trump as an exemplar of a lot of things not to do, stuff that just as a leader may not want to be emulating this. You've also, and again, I just got the book, so I haven't had a chance to really jump into it in any depth. Who are some of the exemplars, some of the people that you cite as being the kinds of leaders that you would love to be able to say, follow that, do that?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of people throughout the book that I cite. Again, two of the examples that come to mind immediately are Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for the moral
Yeah.
courage they displayed, for their patriotism, for their interest in accountability, and for their what they saw as their commitment to justice. There are other folks who worked directly for Trump, for example, in the waning days of the administration, just days before January 6th. The acting Attorney General Rosen and his deputy Donahue were called into the Oval Office, and there was a whole discussion about whether or not they should be fired. So this other guy, Jeffrey Clark, could take the helm and do some things that were not going to be appropriate in terms of trying to overturn the election. The leadership that they displayed comes to mind right away. I mean, what they did essentially was they tried to remain loyal to their boss by convincing him that what was in the national interest was also in his interest. And they also threatened mass resignations.
Right.
But they took a principled stand for what they believed was right. There are certainly a lot of people that I admire whose examples aren't necessarily recent, like John Lewis.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about him in the book. Um, so there are a lot of examples that are folks from the Trump's first term, both within and outside the administration. And then I also go back in history, look at people like General Grant in the Civil War,
Yep.
how he used empathy and respect for dignity. For example, at the surrender at Appomattox, he told his troops that they were not to gloat and celebrate in front of the Confederate troops. And he understood it wasn't just respect for dignity, it was also because he understood that it was important for securing a lasting peace.
Yeah.
Um, so there
Yeah.
are a lot of
The question: how do people feel about themselves when they're in your presence? How do people feel about themselves? That respect and dignity. How do how I engender that? How I make that? Do they feel belittled? Do they feel put down? Do they feel shamed? Do they feel enlightened? Do they feel uplifted? I mean, as a leader, I've got a lot of control about how people experience themselves and the consequence of that. And again, this kind of goes back to the title of the book: what hangs in the balance? If people are feeling disenfranchised, and disillusioned, how do I actually address that
yeah,
as a leader?
or if they're being fired publicly via social
Shamed?
media post or disparaged publicly by their boss, none of those things are helpful. Um, I have a chapter called "Things You Don't Do Publicly." So
Yeah.
it's so important for morale in an organization. And
I
as you
was
spoke about, I think in one of your recent podcasts, ensuring that not only are people treated well, treated with respect, but that they understand, uh, that they understand the meaning of what they're doing, the importance of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of for the sake of what? It kind of goes right back to the leadership causes movement for the sake of what? Yeah, what's the
Right.
meaning here? What does it make possible? Um, there was a question that was just kind of circulating in my mind here. Uh, oh, I was doing some my morning reading this morning. I was revisiting Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, just kind of doing a little deeper dive into a couple of things there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he talked about, I mean, he obviously wrote that. For those of you that may not be familiar with it, he wrote that for himself. It was a private diary, private journal. Um, but he's talking about, and he's looking at, you know, exploring himself, what's going on within me. And it struck me that, most people are total strangers to themselves. They don't really know themselves. And as a leader, I'm making an assumption here, but the more effective I become, the more in touch I am with what's driving me, what's moving me, what's important to me. The more I know myself, the more effective I can actually become. Is that a fair assessment from your
Oh,
experience?
yeah, self-awareness is huge. I think I originally had a whole chapter on the importance of self-awareness. It's one of the casualties of a much needed edit for this manuscript. But yeah, and that speaks to the importance of humility too, how important humility is with respect to self-awareness, um, with with being able to admit what we don't know, and that's so crucial for a leader who's going to be skilled in soliciting expertise. Uh, you have to be willing to hear points of view that you don't agree with. I may be straying a little bit from your question, but
No.
yeah,
Oh,
self-awareness is so important to be able to understand how others see you as well, how your
mm-hmm.
subordinates see you, and how your every word and action is seen by them. I mean, in some regard, you have to see yourself constantly in a spotlight when you're in a position of leadership,
Yeah.
and be aware of, you know, your own feelings and thoughts, but obviously how others perceive those as well.
Yeah. It's kind of, when I walk in the environment, walk in my office or whatever it is, I mean, people pick up, glasses and they start watching me. It's kind of like, and they start making up meaning about what's important to me just based on my presence, based on how I'm walking sometimes. Um, there was a client that I had years ago. Um, the gatekeeper in his, in the C-suite was his administrative assistant, and she had a very interesting semaphore system. If he was in a bad mood, she would have a little thing on her desk that was upright. It was whether it was, and I forget exactly what it was, but she would just kind of stand it up. If he's in a bad mood, and you walk in and you want to talk to him, this flag is up, and you go, okay, tomorrow, I'll come back tomorrow. If it was down, he's in a good mood, he's approachable. And I thought that was just fascinating. He didn't know this. I mean, it was completely out of his awareness, but she took it on herself, in support of him, to be able to, kind of, if you're going to come to him when his head's on fire, when his hair's on fire, you probably don't want to open your mouth right now. Okay,
Well,
come
so
back
going
tomorrow.
back to self-awareness, it makes me think of whether he's even aware that people are noticing this.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And he wasn't. He wasn't. That was a large part of the coaching work I ended up doing with him was, focusing on this self-awareness. Yeah. I remember a conversation I had with Ken Blanchard years ago, situational leadership, author, and, Who Took My Cheese, that little book. Um, but and a very simple thing he said one time was feedback is the breakfast of champions. And if I'm not in a position to actually hear feedback from a trusted, group of folks, I don't want to, I don't want everybody throwing stuff at me, but I want to have people at whose opinions I value, giving me assessments about what's going on here. And what's fascinating to me about feedback or assessments, how, I'll code it both ways. Assessments open doors and they close doors. And it's all about possibilities. And
Hmm.
that's kind of where I want to land what we're doing here right now in this conversation. For me, leadership is the art of generating possibilities in people's minds. And possibilities can become probabilities if we're working with it well, and probabilities can eventually become reality. The art of creating and generating possibilities. When we look at what's hanging in the balance, what kind of a leader, and I'm going to make, I'm asking this, what kind of a leader, knowing what I know is the answer to this question, but how effective would you assess Donald Trump as being in terms of opening possibilities for the nation, not just a select 30% that voted for it out of the voting population that could have voted. He only got a third of the vote. I mean, he literally only got a third of the registered voters. A third of those registered voters voted for him. A third voted for somebody else, and a third didn't vote. So mandate out the window. There is no mandate here. What kind of possibility is he actually generating in your assessment?
Wow. Well, he's creating excitement, I think, for, like you said, his base.
Mm-hmm.
The other maybe 15 or 20% who voted for him, and that 49.8 or 49.9. I'm not sure what they're thinking at this point based on what they've seen in just the first 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Um, that's a tough question. I mean, I think now we're getting into policy,
Yeah. That's and I
which is something
minefield.
oh, sorry, yeah, it's something I try to stay away from in the book to some extent because I don't want it to seem like it's a book on critiquing policy. I bring up a few policies here and there if it's necessarily in the context of a leadership issue I want to discuss, but I tend to focus more on leadership traits and competencies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's why I think even people who are very much supporters of Trump could still learn a lot from this book.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
back to your question. Um, yeah, what kind of possibilities? Um, one of the things that is happening is kind of a capitulation. We're seeing from business leaders and even others who might have stood for what their principles were, what they think the country's principles were. It's been more of a capitulation this time, although it's early days, of course.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's not really a possibility. That's a negative, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's I haven't really thought about the
Yeah.
answer to that question.
It's hanging in the balance.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all the challenges we have right now, domestic and international security threats, political extremism, racial and religious nationalism, tribalism, attacks on truth and science. Those are some of the things that hang in the balance here, and which way things are going to go with those. Obviously, people have different opinions on those
Yeah.
things. Um, but in terms of what possibilities are being created for individuals, um, well, certainly if you're one of the three wealthiest people who attended the inauguration at the expense of governors, I think, who had to sit downstairs, then it's creating some nice financial possibilities for you, probably. But
Yeah.
for
A
the
very
average person,
select few.
yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, and Phil, I mean, I could continue this conversation for a long time here. For me, I've just kind of opened the cover on this thing,
Mm.
because I mean, the idea, where does fear come into play here? Fear is a base emotion. It's really easy to access. Leaders that access that unleash all kinds of stuff. Yeah, ideals, on the other hand, are much more difficult to communicate about and to tap into in the psyche of people. It's kind of like, what's, from a leadership perspective, where do I go? Do I tap into fear, which seems to be the easiest one and the most common one, or do I tap into ideals? I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, yeah, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Ideals. It's a different kind of a thing that comes into play with this.
Yeah. So what comes to mind when you talk about fear? A chapter about fomenting fear is that in a democracy, the combination of decreased faith in your fellow citizens, which is what happens when your rhetoric is based in fear. Um, so when that fear increases, what increases also is the likelihood of radicalization and violence.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we saw, on January 6th. When you're flooding the zone, so to speak, with disinformation and conspiracy theories, it's harmful to a democracy, because you need to have that rational, fact-based discourse, and that's hard to have when you don't have common set of facts, when people no longer value facts or the truth. But that's dangerous. You can't have the rule of law without facts.
Exactly. Exactly. Folks, we've been listening to a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel retired Philippe Johnson, the author of a fascinating new book. When will this actually drop?
It dropped 7 January, actually.
Okay, so it is now available
Yeah,
on Amazon and all of the regular places here. Again,
yeah.
those of you that are watching this, not just listening to it, what hangs in the balance? A case for principled, ethical, competent, and courageously selfless leadership. Pick up a copy of this. It is a fascinating read, and there's just a wealth of data in here that supports the hypothesis that Phil is actually bringing to the table here about the need for ethical leaders, the need for selfless leaders, and literally what hangs in the balance. And this is true not only just for nation states, but it's true for my family. It's also true for my business. Yeah, how do I lead? Yeah, that's on me. That's on me. So, Phil, thank you very much for being a great guest. Like I said, I could continue this conversation for a much longer period than we have available today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. And folks, as you're listening here and as I sign off, my admonition to you, as always, find a way in your life to be a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. Nature works on a model of distribution. That's how nature works. And you want to find yourself and recognize that you are, in fact, a part of nature. So act accordingly. And I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.